Something happened deep underground that no scientist on Earth could explain. A tomb that had been sealed for thousands of years. A tomb that no human being had touched since the ancient world existed. It opened, not because someone forced it, not because an earthquake cracked it. It opened because it recognized someone. And then it spoke. The words it said stopped every archaeologist in that chamber completely cold. Equipment fell silent. Flashlights flickered. Grown scientists stood there with tears running down their faces and had absolutely no explanation for what they had just witnessed. 3 things about this story will genuinely shock you. First, the person it recognized was nobody special. Just an ordinary man doing his job. Second, what the tomb said about him had been encoded thousands of years before his grandfather's grandfather was even born. Third, the institutions that investigated this discovery reportedly tried to bury it. Let me show you exactly how this happened. His name was Daniel Mercer. He was 34 years old. Medium height. Brown hair going slightly gray at the temples. He had a small scar above his left eyebrow from a hiking accident when he was 19. He drank too much coffee. He forgot to eat lunch most days. He had worked in field archaeology for 11 years, and in all that time nothing truly extraordinary had ever happened to him. He was not famous. He was not the lead scientist on the project. He was not even supposed to be in that part of the site on that particular afternoon. He was a mechanic. Not a historian. Not a linguist. Not a professor with 3 degrees and a published book. Daniel Mercer fixed things. He maintained the generators that powered the underground lighting rigs. He repaired the ventilation systems that kept the tunnels breathable. He tightened bolts and replaced worn cables, and made sure the expensive equipment that the actual scientists used every single day kept functioning without failure. That was his job. That was all his job was. The excavation site was located in a remote section of the Egyptian desert, roughly 40 miles from the nearest city. The project had been running for almost 3 years at that point. It was a serious operation. 12 lead archaeologists, supporting researchers from 4 different universities, government liaisons, security personnel, equipment worth millions of dollars spread across a dig site covering nearly 2 square kilometers of ancient ground. They had found extraordinary things already. Pottery fragments dating back beyond recorded history. Partial wall carvings that matched no known ancient language. Strange metallic residue in the soil that the lab teams kept sending back for ray analysis because the results kept coming back wrong. According to sources close to the project, at least 2 senior researchers had already quietly filed for early reassignment before the most significant discovery was even made. Something about this place made people uncomfortable. That was the word most commonly used in the private communications that would later be reviewed. Uncomfortable. People slept badly. People argued more than usual. 3 separate team members reportedly experienced the same recurring dream over a period of several weeks. A dream involving a sealed door and a voice behind it counting down to something. None of that was in any official report. Daniel did not have those dreams. Daniel slept fine. Daniel ate his sandwiches, fixed his generators, and kept to himself. He was well liked, but not close with many people on the team. He listened more than he talked. He noticed things quietly and rarely mentioned what he noticed. On the afternoon that everything changed, he had been sent to the lower tunnels to check on a ventilation coupling that had been reporting irregular pressure readings since that morning. It was routine maintenance. He had done it a dozen times in different sections of the site. He took his tools and his flashlight, and he went alone because there was no reason not to go alone. The lower tunnels were different from the upper excavation areas. Up top there was noise and activity, and the ordinary chaos of a working dig. Down below it was silent in a way that felt less like absence of sound, and more like the presence of something holding its breath. The tunnel walls were older stone. Much older. The kind of stone that has spent so long underground it takes on a different quality, a weight and a density that you can feel even without touching it. Daniel noticed the side passage when his flashlight beam caught the edge of it on his way back from the coupling check. It was not on any of the site maps he had seen. It was not marked with any of the survey tape that the team used to track explored areas. It was just there, a passage cut into the ancient stone, so cleanly it looked almost machined. The edges were perfect, too perfect for the tools of any civilization that supposedly existed when this section of the site was first constructed. He stood at the entrance for a long moment. He looked down the passage. He should have turned around. He knew that. Every protocol he had ever been trained on said clearly that undocumented passages were to be reported immediately and left completely undisturbed until a qualified team could investigate properly. Daniel Mercer took one step forward, then another, and the passage sealed behind him without making a single sound. He spun around immediately. The wall behind him was solid stone. No gap, no seam, no evidence at all that a passage had ever existed in that direction. He pressed both hands flat against it and pushed. Nothing moved. He ran his fingers along every edge he could find and felt nothing but smooth, continuous rock. He was not panicking. That surprised him later when he thought about it. He should have been panicking. Instead, he felt something much stranger. He felt calm, a deep and settling calm that seemed to come from somewhere outside himself, like warm water spreading slowly through his chest. He turned back around and kept walking. The passage was about 40 meters long. His flashlight lit the walls as he moved, and what he saw on those walls stopped him several times. The carvings were extraordinary, not the kind of carvings you find in typical archaeological sites. These were not pictograms telling simple stories about harvests or battles or gods receiving offerings. These were complex, layered. Some of them appeared to exist in 3 dimensions, recessed into the stone in ways that created shifting shadow patterns depending on the angle of light, patterns that seemed almost to move. Among the carvings, there were symbols he did not recognize. That meant nothing coming from him since he was not a linguist. But there were also symbols he did recognize, not because he had studied them, but because he had seen them somewhere personal, somewhere private. His grandmother had drawn those symbols. She had drawn them on small pieces of paper that she kept folded in a wooden box beside her bed. She had told him as a small child that they were family marks. Old marks, marks that had been in their family for as long as anyone could remember passing down. She had told him seriously and without any humor that he should remember them because they would matter one day. He had thought it was the charming eccentricity of a very old woman who loved her history. He was looking at those exact marks carved into a sealed underground passage in the Egyptian desert thousands of miles from where his grandmother had grown up. He kept walking. The passage opened into a chamber. It was large, larger than the passage had suggested it would be. The ceiling rose high above him, high enough that his flashlight beam lost itself before reaching the top. The floor was flat and smooth and completely clear of debris, which was remarkable given how old everything around him clearly was. In most ancient spaces of this age, the floors were thick with centuries of accumulated dust and sediment. This floor looked recently swept. At the center of the chamber was a sarcophagus. It was unlike anything he had ever seen pictured in any archaeological publication or documentary. It was not made of stone. It appeared to be made of a single continuous piece of dark material that was not quite metal and not quite stone, but something in between, something that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its surface was covered entirely in the same complex layered carvings as the passage walls, but here they were more dense, more intricate, covering every centimeter of the surface in patterns that his eyes kept wanting to follow in circles. Around the base of the sarcophagus, at regular intervals, stood 12 narrow columns. Each column was topped with a shallow bowl. Each bowl contained a substance that was faintly luminescent, not glowing brightly, just barely lit from within, the way certain deep ocean creatures produce their own cold, quiet light. The room should have been dead. It was not. Daniel could feel it breathing. He stood at the edge of the chamber and looked at all of it, and his calm held steady, and that steadiness itself was the most frightening thing about the entire experience, because nothing about this situation called for calm, and yet calm was all he felt. He sneezed. It was completely involuntary. The ancient dust in the air, or whatever the luminescent substance in those bowls was releasing, hit the back of his nose, and he sneezed once. Hard, the sharp human sound of it cracking through the absolute silence of that ancient sealed space. The sarcophagus lit up like a sun. The light was not aggressive. That was the first thing he registered. He had flinched back and covered his eyes, expecting something painful, but the light that poured from the sarcophagus was warm. It was the color of late afternoon sun coming through old curtains. It was the color of his grandmother's kitchen in the early morning. It filled the entire chamber without a single shadow remaining anywhere, and in that total warm illumination everything became visible at once. The carvings on the walls were moving. Not violently, not chaotically. They were shifting slowly and with great deliberateness, symbols rotating and realigning, new configurations forming as old ones dissolved, the entire surface of every wall in the chamber alive with slow, purposeful motion. The 12 bowls on the 12 columns brightened in sequence around the sarcophagus, one after another, a slow circle of increasing light like a countdown completing itself. And then the voice came. It did not come from any specific direction. It came from everywhere at once, from the walls and the floor and the air itself, a voice that was simultaneously ancient beyond comprehension and completely clear, articulate, present in a way that felt immediate and personal, and directed with absolute precision at one specific human being standing in that chamber. It spoke in a language Daniel did not know. He understood every single word. That fact alone, that impossible fact, would occupy researchers and linguists and cognitive scientists for years afterward in the investigations that followed. How does a man with no relevant language training understand a spoken language that does not appear in any recorded human linguistic database anywhere on Earth? There is no satisfying scientific answer to that question. There are theories. There are reportedly some very uncomfortable theories that certain institutions have been extremely reluctant to publish openly. What the voice said, translated as accurately as human language allows, was this: the seal has waited. The bloodline has returned. What was placed in trust has found its keeper. The heir of the covenant stands in the place of returning. What was separated is now recognized. What was hidden is now claimed. You are the continuation of what we began. You carry what we could not keep. The inheritance is yours. The door is open. Come forward. Daniel stood completely still. He was crying. He did not know when he had started crying. Tears were running freely down his face, and he was not embarrassed by them because embarrassment requires the presence of some normal social reality, and there was nothing normal about any reality he currently occupied. He said the only thing his mind produced. He said, out loud, in the empty ancient chamber, to a voice that had apparently been waiting thousands of years to speak to him specifically, I think there's been a mistake. The voice, impossibly, responded, no mistake. The markers are exact. The biological signature matches the encoded record within acceptable drift parameters for the elapsed time. You are who you are. The recognition is complete. Biological signature, encoded record, drift parameters. These were not the words of ancient mysticism. These were not the metaphors of religious tradition or the poetic language of ancient ritual. These were technical terms, specific, clinical. the kind of language that belongs in a laboratory report or an engineering specification. Something had encoded his specific biological information into that sarcophagus. Something had been checking for a match, for what researchers would later calculate, based on the dating of the chamber materials, was somewhere between 8 and 12,000 years. He took one step toward the sarcophagus. The 12 columns pulsed in unison. The carvings on the walls shifted into a new configuration and held there, perfectly still, as if they had been waiting specifically for this alignment, as if every previous movement had been preparation, and this stillness was the completion. He reached out and placed his right hand flat against the surface of the sarcophagus. It opened. The inside of the sarcophagus was not what any definition of the word prepared a person to expect. There was no body. There had never been a body inside it. The space within was not shaped for a human form. It was shaped instead like the interior of a very precise container, built to hold specific objects without movement, without damage, across an incomprehensible span of time. Each object sat in a perfectly fitted recess, held in place by a material that had maintained its integrity across however many thousands of years, separated the moment of sealing from the moment of opening. There were 7 objects. The first was a flat rectangular piece of the same dark material as the sarcophagus exterior. Its surface was covered in the same dense moving symbols, and when Daniel touched it, the symbols stopped moving and arranged themselves into a stable pattern, as though his touch had caused them to focus, to address him specifically. He would later describe this to researchers as feeling like watching a screen load, except that the screen was ancient stone and the loading was recognition. The second was a small sphere, perfectly smooth, that emitted the same warm luminescent light as the column bowls, but from within itself, from its very center, light that pulsed with the slow regularity of a heartbeat. When he picked it up, the pulse rate changed. It matched his own heartbeat exactly within seconds. The third was something that looked, in the warm light of the open chamber, remarkably like a seed. A single large seed enclosed in a clear material that was neither glass nor plastic, but preserved whatever was inside with perfect clarity. The seed was dark and complex in its surface geometry, clearly biological, clearly old, clearly something that would be impossible to carbon date accurately, because the preservation medium appeared to have arrested all decay processes completely at the moment of sealing. The fourth, fifth, and sixth objects were documents. That was the simplest word for them. Flat sheets of the dark material covered in encoded information, information that the research teams would spend years attempting to fully translate. What was translated in the early stages suggested, according to sources close to the project, that these documents contained something like a technical inheritance. Instructions, specifications, knowledge encoded for a specific recipient to receive at a specific point in time. The seventh object was the one that caused the most sustained scientific and institutional disruption of anything discovered in that chamber. It was a small device. It was unmistakably a device, not a ceremonial object, not a decorative piece, not a religious artifact in any traditional understanding of that term. It had moving components. It had what appeared to be interface elements, areas of its surface that responded to touch in ways that suggested function rather than symbolism. It was powered by something that generated no heat and left no chemical signature that any instrument brought to the site was capable of detecting. It worked. That was the devastating detail. It worked. An object placed in a sealed underground chamber somewhere between 8 and 12,000 years ago, by whoever or whatever had constructed that chamber, was in full working condition at the moment Daniel Mercer opened the sarcophagus and picked it up. He held all 7 objects one by one, and with each one the chamber responded. The light shifted, the symbols reconfigured, the voice spoke brief specific phrases that he understood completely and could not explain understanding. What he did not know in those moments was that above him, on the surface, the dig site had gone completely dark. Every generator had cut out simultaneously. Every communication device had stopped functioning. Every compass on the site was spinning freely with no stable north. And every single person working at the site had stopped what they were doing and was standing completely still, looking down at the ground, at the exact spot above the chamber where Daniel Mercer stood alone with his impossible inheritance, as if the earth itself was broadcasting something upward through the stone and sand, and they were all, without understanding why, receiving it. He came up through a passage that had not existed when he went down. Not the original passage, not the one that had sealed behind him. A different one. A passage that rose directly upward through 40 feet of compacted ancient stone, and opened in the floor of the main excavation tent like it had always been there. Like the site maps had simply overlooked it for 3 years of intensive survey work, which was not possible, which everyone standing there knew was absolutely not possible. And yet there it was. Daniel walked up through it carrying the 7 objects. He walked out into the night air of the Egyptian desert, and every person on that site turned to look at him at the same moment. The same smooth collective turn, and not one of them said a single word. Dr. Sarah Aucaffer was the lead archaeologist on the project. She had 3 degrees, 2 published books, and 20 years of field experience across 4 continents. She was not a person given to speechlessness. She was known specifically for her composure under pressure, for her precise and methodical response to unexpected findings, for the calm authority with which she had managed difficult situations across a long and distinguished career. She looked at Daniel Mercer standing in the desert night holding objects that should not exist, and she sat down on the nearest equipment case and put her face in her hands. Nobody spoke for a very long time. What happened in the weeks that followed is a matter of significant dispute. The official record, such as it exists, is incomplete in ways that several members of the research team have since described publicly as deliberate. Equipment was removed. Access to the site was restricted. Communication from team members was reportedly monitored, and in some cases interfered with. At least 3 researchers who attempted to publish early findings were approached by representatives of institutions. They declined to name publicly and strongly advised to reconsider. The chamber was ray-sealed, not by the ancient mechanism, by human hands with modern equipment, concrete and steel, and a security perimeter that extended 200 meters in every direction from the site entrance. But here is what they could not seal. The 7 objects were not in the chamber when they went back for them. They were with Daniel. And Daniel, in the 48 hours between coming up through that impossible passage and the arrival of the institutional representatives who came to take charge of the situation, had done something that nobody had anticipated and nobody could fully explain or prevent. He had understood the documents, not translated them, not decoded them with instruments or research, understood them the way you understand your own name when someone calls it across a crowded room, the way you understand a face you have known for your entire life. The knowledge inside those documents had moved into him the moment he touched them, and it sat inside his mind, now as naturally and completely as any memory from his own lived experience. He knew things. He knew things about human biology that no current science had mapped. He knew things about energy and matter that would take existing physics several generations to catch up to. He knew things about the history of this planet that were not present in any record, academic or religious or cultural, currently accessible to any human institution. And he knew one thing above all others. He was not the first heir to stand in that chamber. There had been others before him, across the long span of time since the chamber was sealed, others who had carried the biological markers, others who had gotten close. None of them had made it to the sarcophagus. Something had always prevented it. Circumstance, misdirection, institutional interference that stretched back further than any current institution had existed, suggesting continuity of suppression so old it had become structural. Invisible, a feature of human civilization rather than a choice any living person had made. He was the first in 12,000 years to complete the return. The inheritance was his, and he had only just begun to understand what that meant. Here is the detail that changes everything. Among the encoded documents inside that sarcophagus, translated carefully over the months that followed, was a specific passage researchers described as a warning addressed to the heir directly. It said this: "The knowledge you now carry was removed from this world for a reason. Not hidden from you, hidden through you. You were always the safest place to keep it, because they would never think to look inside an ordinary person." Daniel Mercer, the maintenance mechanic who fixed generators and forgot to eat lunch, was not a random recipient of an ancient inheritance. He was the inheritance. The whole point was always him. If this opened your eyes to how much of our history has been deliberately kept just out of reach, then what comes next will shake you even deeper. Here is what this story leaves us with. An ordinary man. An impossible chamber. A voice that waited 12,000 years for the right biological match to walk through the door. And a world of institutions that moved fast and quietly to make sure as few people as possible heard about any of it. The knowledge exists. The inheritance was claimed. And somewhere out there, reportedly, a maintenance mechanic who just wanted to fix a ventilation coupling is sitting with 7 impossible objects and a mind full of information that could rewrite everything. If this story hit you the way it hit us, hit that subscribe button right now, because we go deep into stories exactly like this every single week, and you do not want to miss what is coming next. Drop one word in the comments below. Just one word that describes how this story made you feel. We read every single one. And if you want to go further, our next video covers another sealed discovery that connects directly to what Daniel found inside that chamber. Here is our specific question for you today. If you were Daniel, would you share what you know or protect it ***? Tell us below. The conversation is already happening,